Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Her Excellency Retno Masudi, Honorable Rector of University Gadjah Mada, Professor Kannawati, my friends from University of Queensland, particularly Dean Tim Dunn, ambassadors and students, it's my great pleasure to talk about the Bandung Conference 60th anniversary and give you some remarks about its implications for international order. Now, I have given a lot of speeches around the world, but when I speak on Bandung, it tends to be more from the heart rather than from the mind. So please forgive me if I digress a little bit and tell you some anecdotes. I've spent a lot of time studying this conference, and not everything I have studied have been published yet. But you will see some things here which have never been published. You'll see some pictures today which have never been also published, although they're around. But it took me about a decade to collect them, and I'll put together half of my presentation will be in pictures. So can we go to the first slide? Briefly, what was the Bandung Conference? As President Sukarno, who opened the conference, said, now can we go back? Yeah. It was the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind. This is what President Sukarno said when he opened the conference. Can we go back to the next slide? No. So go forward. No? Forward more? Forward more? Okay. This is President Sukarno. No, the next one. Right. Arriving to open the Bandung Conference. And just outside the conference hall. And the next one. This is him giving the opening address to the conference. And I'll come back to this later, but let's go back to the first slide again. I'm sorry, I thought I will be handling this myself, but okay. Who are the sponsors of Bandung Conference? I understand that you have rooms named after each of the sponsors in this university. So there were 5: India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, of course, Indonesia as the host. And they were collectively known as the Colombo Powers. Because the first time these 5 prime ministers met together, it was in Colombo. And they're also known as the Conference of Southeast Asian Prime Ministers. One very interesting thing here is that today we don't include India, Pakistan, Ceylon in Southeast Asia. But those days, they were part of Southeast Asia. So can we go back to go forward? Yeah, those are the 5 prime ministers. To your extreme left is Premier UNU, then Burma, now Myanmar, and Muhammad Ali, Prime Minister of Pakistan, of course Ali Satomojoyo, the Prime Minister of Indonesia, and John Kotlawala, the Prime Minister of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and of course Jawaharlal Nehru to the right, Prime Minister of India. Those were the 5 prime ministers who collectively known as the Colombo Powers, who officially convened the Bandung Conference, but the Indonesians were the host. It was actually an Indonesian idea. There's no question that the idea of holding a conference was Indonesia's. But with the support of the 4 prime ministers, and particularly India, it was possible to hold that conference at that time. Okay, go back to the first slide. There are the dates of the conference. No, not the next one. Yeah, okay. 18th to 24th of April, 1955. There were really 5 days of deliberation, and then there were a couple of days people coming and going, 5 days of deliberation. And there were actually 29 countries, but there were 30 leaders present. 29 leaders, but there were 30 countries represented. Gold Coast, which became Ghana, was not an independent country at that time. And the British government prevented Nkrumah from coming to Bandung because Ghana was still under British, it had a dominion status. It could not control its foreign affairs. Why the ANC was represented by 2 delegates. Now, why did the British forbid Nkrumah of Ghana to come to Bandung? And there lies the story. And I will talk about it. What was the concern of the British and the Americans about Bandung? Okay, next slide, please. I will be showing you a number of photos to give you a flavor of those 5 days and that period. And then I will go to the details of my presentation. Okay, next one. This is Jawaharlal Nehru of India and UNO of Burma. They flew in the same plane, and this is at the airport in Bandung, just being received and taken to their hotel. So this is a very common sight those days. Delegations arriving and people taking them to their hotels. The next one. This is Nehru and Sukarno greeting each other. And next one. This is Chou En-lai with, of course, President Sukarno and Prime Minister Ali. Next one. This is, I showed it to you, President Sukarno arriving to open the conference. Next one. President Sukarno giving his address. Next one. This is a meeting of the inside of the hall, where the leaders are taking a group photo, and you can see Nehru and President Sukarno and various other people, leaders behind them, around them. Next one. This is a plenary session, and the person who is clapping is Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he's a big actor. The most popular man at this conference, in fact, was not Chou En-lai, but Nasser. And his role was very crucial in redefining international order after Bandung. I'll come back to that. Next one. The political committee is where all the 29 leaders met. This was the most significant committee. The Bandung Conference had 3 committees: political committee, economic committee, and the socio-cultural committee. But the political committee is where the leaders met, and all the negotiations actually happened in that political committee. Okay, next one. And this was also a people's conference. So various leaders from time to time went and actually spoke to the crowd outside the conference hall, but in other parts of Indonesia as well. And they climbed up to this podium and addressed the people, and people are extremely excited when this was happening. So this was not like today's conferences, like ASEAN conference or APEC conference, when people stay somewhere else and the leaders meet. People were very much involved in that. It was a very open conference. By the way, a lot of Western leaders camped outside Bandung. They wanted to know what was going on. So every Western country had sent their ambassadors, and also Russians as well, and they were camping outside Bandung. They were trying to find out minute by minute. Some say there were more spies in Bandung than leaders and delegates. But the Western countries are very worried about what was happening in Bandung. And I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, next. So let me just talk about 5 key legacies of Bandung. There are many, but I categorize them into 5. The first one is a challenge to Western, and in that sense, particularly to UK-US dominance, and especially in frustrating the UK-US efforts to sabotage the conference. I choose the word sabotage deliberately and very carefully, and it is true. And I'll show you the proof in a minute. Reshaping the Cold War and the birth of the non-aligned movement. And this had to do with Egypt's turn to the Soviet bloc, which partly happened in Bandung. Delegitimation of the Cold War pacts like SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. The seeds of Sino-Soviet rift. It actually played a much bigger role, and many people don't know about some of these, especially the third one. And I'll talk about it. Then the third legacy is creating a normative order, support for anti-colonial movements, affirmation of human rights, support for the United Nations. People don't realize that this was a big thing. 9 of the 29 countries at Bandung were not members of the United Nations at that time. Getting membership in the UN was not automatic. Ceylon had to wait for a long time. And the demand of Bandung was to get everybody, make it a really universal organization. Norms of international relations, the Dasasila 10 principles that we talked about. Then the fourth legacy will be an impact on inter-ASEAN relations, engagement of China, polarization of Asia, some good effects, some bad effects. Nehru and Chou En-lai, so-called rivalry, I'll talk about this. The emergence of Southeast Asia. In fact, Southeast Asia as a region would not have come on to own without Bandung. As I said, the 5 sponsors of Bandung included India, China, and Ceylon. Today, nobody calls them Southeast Asian. They're South Asian countries. But it was after Bandung that the idea of Southeast Asia and the idea of ASEAN became more crystallized. And in a very important sense, Bandung, there's no direct link, but Bandung paved the way for ASEAN regionalism and ASEAN centrality. And then a committee of civilizations. as opposed to a class of civilizations. Very important legacy. Okay, next one. The first one is challenge to Western dominance. Now, Bandung happened at a time in the 1950s. So this was the anti-colonial movements going on, but Asia had become independent. Africa was the last continent to become independent. So the challenge of decolonization still remained. The British, who still had a lot of influence, both in Asia, British still had their base in Singapore, by the way, and they prevented David Marshall of Singapore from coming to Bandung actively. They prevented Nkrumah of Ghana from coming to Bandung. But Britain was worried that Bandung will kill off the remaining colonial possessions, including in Asia, but some in Africa and the Caribbean as well. So they were very concerned about that. For Americans, the concern was not so much colonialism, but Cold War. The Americans are worried about expansion of communist bloc influence, and they were particularly worried that China will take advantage of Bandung to break out of the isolation. The People's Republic of China, which had been isolated by Americans, and it was part of American containment policy. And this was a time the United States believed that China and the Soviet Union are part of a monolithic communist bloc. So the United States was extremely worried about China taking advantage of Bandung to normalize its relations with Asian countries. So what was the response of the US-UK? Influence and manipulate the conference through friendly delegations, particularly Turkey, Pakistan, Philippines, and Thailand. Next slide, please. How do I find this out? Well, a lot of research, but very, very significant, never been published. I wrote a few articles here and there, one in Financial Times, the record basically shows very clearly what the British tried to do. Okay, next one. This is a policy document, which was actually before it was finalized, so there's a bit of handwritten element there, handwritten notes there. First, the British tried to discourage their allies from going into Bandung. So they said that to the Turks and the Pakistanis, don't go, boycott the conference. Then they had a debate in the Foreign Ministry, Foreign Office, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office those days, and they realized that if you try to boycott the conference, it will look really bad in the eyes of the international community. So instead of boycotting, and also if you don't go there, you cannot influence the conference. So instead of boycotting, tell your friends and allies what they should be saying in that conference and how they should behave, and try to manipulate their intervention to satisfy the British and American objectives, which is, no advancement of the decolonization or anti-colonial agenda for the British, and for Americans, no gain in influence for China. So there were three objectives: to prevent the adoption by the conference of any resolution advantageous to the communists or inimical to British interests, to prevent the emergence from the conference of any more lasting Afro-Asian bloc. They did not want an Afro-Asian organization to come, and to cause maximum embarrassment to the communists. The communists were, by the way, Chinese were called Chicums, Chinese communists. So a lot of documents call them Chicums. And the little handwritten thing over there is basically a realistic presentation of the facts. Now, what are the realistic presentation of the facts? They basically gave them a lot of guidance documents. The British Foreign Office produced a number of documents and circulated them by diplomatic bag containing various issues. So if colonialism comes up, what would you say? Well, communism is a form of colonialism. So that was what the British said, and they sent it to John Kotlawala of Ceylon, who was kind of anti-communist, even though he was kind of very deferential to India, Nehru, who was non-aligned. But he also did not like the Chinese. He didn't want the Chinese to be invited to Bandung. So John Kotlawala actually stood up during the political committee meetings and said communism is a new form of colonialism, which made Chou En-lai lost his cool. Only time in Bandung that Chou En-lai lost his cool and got angry was in response to this. And the next day Chou En-lai made a presentation refuting that. But the British succeeded in doing that. But there were a lot of things. Mr. Romulo, the Foreign Secretary of Philippines, went to meet Secretary of State Dulles and President Eisenhower 2 weeks before Bandung, and were given a resolution. If the issue of Taiwan comes up, introduce that resolution. And lo and behold, he did that, and it's on the diplomatic record. So you can find it from the archives the resolution being given to him, and then in the committee, political committee, records that the resolution was adopted, or at least proposed by the Philippines. Some of this is quite benign, but some of them are also deliberately used to frustrate the conference and prevent a consensus. The idea was that there should be no common declaration at Bandung. Even though the conference goes on, there should be no consensus, and cause embarrassment to China. So we will see in the end how this succeeded, whether this succeeded. But this is the UK, there are volumes of this, and I have actual documents, exactly what was being said to which delegation. And the Americans, the British tried their friends, the Americans basically focused on Philippines and Turkey, because Turkey was a member of the Central Treaty Organization, or Baghdad Pact, and Philippines was a member of the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Okay, next one. The second legacy is the birth of non-alignment. As Madam Foreign Minister said, Bandung was really the beginning of foreign non-aligned movement. But it is a myth. Some people say Tito was actually at Bandung, Nkrumah was at Bandung. No such thing. Tito never was invited, Nkrumah was invited. He was the incoming Prime Minister of Ghana, but Ghana was still a dominion of the British, meaning it can control its domestic policy and not its foreign relations. So they didn't come. But the person who did come to Bandung and made most of the impact in creating non-aligned movement, apart from Nehru and, of course, Sukarno, was this person. Go to the next photo. Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was the hero of this conference. He was mobbed by people everywhere. He had just taken over power in Egypt just a year before. This was his first international trip. He was very young and very enthusiastic, and played without Nasser, there would be no consensus on the Bandung Declaration. But there was more to it. So next one. The American State Department made an assessment, intelligence assessment of Nasser just before this conference. And you can see this assessment, friendly to the West, and especially to the United States. From beginning of the regime and since the Suez Agreement and shipment of UK arms to Egypt, has become increasingly friendly to Britain. This is a classic intelligence failure, because 6 months later, Nasser would nationalize the Suez Canal, buy weapons from Czechoslovakia, not directly from the Soviet Union, and try to oppose US influence, British influence throughout the Middle East. So this was a classic intelligence failure. And there is a hint of that. However, since the signing of the Turco-Iraqi Pact, this is the Baghdad Pact, which became the Central Treaty Organization, which Nasser believed will damage Egypt's position of leadership among the Arab states, Nasser has become more reserved about the West. So what happened was, I don't know whether we have the photo. Let's go to the next photo. Next slide, please. You can see that China and Egypt are sitting next to each other because alphabetically. So Zhou Enlai and Nasser has never been to an international conference. And this is the first international conference for China without the Soviet Union being present. This was really the first. And they met at Bandung. And a deal was struck where Nasser, who was getting weapons from the British, and the British had all kinds of conditions and conditionalities, asked the Chinese if he could ask the Soviet Union to give him weapons. And the Chinese, actually first he asked the Chinese for weapons, and Zhou Enlai said, we don't have weapons, we also get our weapons from the Soviet Union, so we will ask the Russians to give you weapons. So the Russians provided weapons through the very famous Czechoslovakia-Egypt arms deal. And within 6 months, Nasser has nationalized the Suez Canal, the British, French invade Egypt and Suez, and the Americans are forced to oppose that, and the rest is history. And Nasser also became a founding member of the non-aligned movement. Egypt was a founding member of the non-aligned movement. So these fundamentally reset the Cold War. And a lot of people don't know about this. This research is not just about Bandung. You have to go to Cold War history archives, but it's a very clear, very important link of how Bandung reset international order. And this was, you can see Nasser is always saluting, always in his best form. Okay, next one. this is the other aspect of the Cold War that Bandung affected, delegitimizing the Dulles Pactomania. John Foster Dulles, of American Secretary of State, loved signing treaties. So after NATO, it was the CETO or the Manila Pact, then the Baghdad Pact or the CENTO. And Jawaharlal Nehru of India was extremely opposed, adamantly opposed to this. And one of the highlights of Bandung happened on the 23rd of April in 1955, when Nehru, in his speech to the political committee, launched into a bitter attack on alliances. It is an intolerable thought to me that the great countries of Asia and Africa should come out of bondage into freedom only to degrade themselves or humiliate themselves in this way. He used very strong words, for which he had to take it back later on, because countries like Philippines and Turkey attacked him. So how we signed the pact, so are you saying we are degrading and humiliating ourselves? And Nehru apologized. But the point was, he basically argued, and I think successfully in the end, that membership in Cold War defense pacts, such as CETO and CENTO, rendered a country a camp follower and deprived of its freedom and dignity. Now, despite the strong words, he said, it is a violation of your sovereignty to be members of these unequal pacts with big powers. And by the way, Madam read those 10 principles of Bandung, and I will go back to that again. Can you go to the next slide? The Dasasila. And look at those principles 6A and B, and principle 5. The principle 5 is respect for the right of each nation to defend itself singly or collectively. So right of collective defense. We can do that. NATO does that. CETO does that. But the next one, abstention from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the great powers. This is what covered the Cold War pacts. The pacts like CETO and CENTO served the interest of a few countries, especially the big powers like the United States or Britain, and countries should abstain from joining that. By the way, this became part of the non-aligned movement. The founding declaration of the non-aligned movement exactly uses the same language. Singly or collectively is okay, but abstention from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the big powers. So Bandung directly led to the non-aligned movement's normative architecture. And of course, the rest we know. Very important point about human rights, I'll come back. Number one in Dasasila is human rights, number one. There's such a big myth about human rights. It's a pity that Chris Roy Smith is not here, our colleague from Queensland University. He wrote a book where he refuted the propaganda, the very Western-centric view that for some reason developing countries or the third world countries wanted socio-cultural rights or economic rights and opposed political rights, and somehow they want exceptionalism. Far from it. The developing countries, post-colonial countries at the forefront, and Chris Roy Smith writes in his book, but I also have an article deriving from Bandung Conference. They wanted political rights. They were self-critical of their own performance. Go to the next one. No, a little bit further. I'll come back to this. Universal principles. Okay, we'll come back to this. On human rights, Bandung was quite important. Okay, let's continue with the next slide. So what happened to the outcome on the Cold War pact? So Nehru's attack on Cold War alliances, criticized by Turkey, which is the leading country on behalf of the West, member of CETO, CENTO, Lebanon, Philippines. But CETO was doomed. And this is why it was doomed. And this is the UK Foreign Office assessment after Bandung. Any hope that might have existed that additional states could be attracted to CETO has now vanished. And a growing tendency towards neutralist attitude in line with India's position is to be expected. So basically the Americans and the British thought by frustrating Bandung, they will increase membership in CETO. CETO had been signed a year earlier in Manila, September 1954. But India, Indonesia, Ceylon, and Burma refused an invitation from Britain on behalf of the US to go and sign, even to attend the Manila conference. Only Pakistan did. So the British and Americans hoped that after Bandung, if they can cause maximum embarrassment to the Chinese, create the fear of the Chinese, they will attract more members to CETO. But that was the opposite was the case. The Chinese did very well, Chou En-lai, and India's position actually was, in that sense, vindicated. CETO was doomed. CETO collapsed was closed in 1975, but it was never really a functioning alliance after Bandung. And next one. This is another point about Bandung that people don't realize. Sino-Soviet rift. Bandung, as I said, the first international conference for communist China without the USSR being present. The Bandung saw the emergence of China as a great Asian power and not merely as an isolated partner of Russia. China did not consult the Soviet Union on communist the stand that it took. The Soviet ambassador was the unhappiest man in Jakarta and Bandung. Okay. Next, on human rights. There was a myth that Bandung countries were anti-human rights. Somehow they supported economic rights and not political rights. But here is Nehru in the opening day of the Bandung Conference, that we have no right to criticize others. He meant the colonial powers for violating human rights if we ourselves do not observe them. So very self-critical. The declaration itself has this language. The Asian-African Conference declares its full support for fundamental principles of human rights as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations and takes note of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Now, there's a little politics here. You can say that the fundamental principles of human rights in the UN Charter gets precedence over the Universal Declaration. Whereas the West thinks the Universal Declaration is the benchmark, the Bandung countries decided that the Universal Declaration did not involve a lot of non-Western countries. It was drafted basically by the West. So the UN Charter human rights principles are broader than the Universal Declaration. But both were actually there. There was a lot of debate about this. I have an article in Global Governance that explains this. But there was no question of developing countries or Bandung countries rejecting human rights in whatever form. The only controversy came when China said, we are not a member of the United Nations. We are not in the, communist China was not represented. It was the nationalist China. And we are not party to the drafting of the Universal Declaration. So you are asking us to endorse a document that we haven't even seen and read, and we didn't have any role in drafting. But the Chinese backtracked on this because of pressure from other countries, including India. So human rights was front and center. Number one of the 10 principles of Bandung is human rights. Okay, next one. The support for universalism, UN also. The Americans and the British were very afraid that Bandung will create an Afro-Asian bloc and undermine the UN, because 9 out of the 29 countries were not members of UN at that time. And, but this was like, again, a kind of paranoia. There was no question about the UN not being endorsed or UN being rejected. So, but the demand was that membership in the UN should be universal. There should not be any conditionality. As long as a country becomes independent, it should become a member of the UN. Don't have to keep it waiting, because that's what the Western countries were doing, basically using the UN membership as a leverage to influence the foreign policy of newly independent countries. And demanded, the conference demanded that the UN Security Council to admit those Bandung participants. There were 9 of them that were not members of the UN. So there was no question of undermining the UN. There was actually full support for the UN and universalism. Next one. Impact on Asian regional relations. Here it becomes a bit complicated. Now, Bandung was the first conference where India tried out its engaging China policy. Now we talk about engaging China. Nehru was the first articulator of engaging China. Nehru argued that inviting China, communist China to Bandung will draw China away from the Soviet Union and bring it closer to Asia. It will emphasize China's Asian identity as opposed to China's communist identity. And at that time, the Americans believed that communism is a monolith and the Chinese and the Soviet Union are actually in the same camp and following each other. So Nehru insisted on Chinese participation over objections from pro-Western countries. There was an astonishing committee between Nehru and Chou En-lai, which is reflected in that sentence. The British report that Chou En-lai was reported to have said any English phrase which was acceptable to Nehru would be acceptable to him. So because the Chinese don't speak English very well, so they accepted Indian translations of this. But Nehru and Chou also, the media, Western media had a field day portraying them as rivals. So a lot of the press reporting of Bandung is about Nehru and Chou En-lai rivalry, and there is a lot of myth about it. The relationship broke 5 years later, but in Bandung, it never really broke down to the extent that the media portrayed it. Nehru was criticized for, well, Chou En-lai did very well in one sense. He was very charming. He came across as tolerant, as flexible. Nehru, on the other hand, was criticized for his arrogance. And there are some pictures that will speak to it. Can we go to the next one? This is Nehru and Chou En-lai at Bandung. And next one. This is Chou En-lai. He's not drinking alcohol, by the way. He is with the V.K. Krishna Menon, one of the leading Indian delegates, close advisor to Nehru. So he was projecting this image of laughing, taking it easy, having a good time. And the next one, this is the problem with Pakistan and Philippines. Well, they were kind of the pro-Western camp and they gave China a very hard time. Next one. And this is Nehru. Nehru came across as arrogant. And you can see this picture. This is a classic, as if like he's trying to poke Uno on his heart. And Nehru actually admitted that he was in a grumpy mood most of the time at Bandung. When he went back, he wrote a letter to Edwin Mountbatten and said, I was in a bad mood most of the time, and Chou En-lai was in a good mood all the time. But he never really felt that he took any umbrage to anything. He said it was a great conference. And the British actually assessments agree with him, that this idea that Nehru was eclipsed by Chou En-lai is a bit of an exaggeration, because it was Nehru who brought China into the conference, and he helped Chou En-lai throughout the conference, in the beginning at least. He actually arranged a meeting between Chou En-lai and the Thai delegate, Prince Wan, which is why the Thais after the conference moved a bit closer to China. And he did say that I was in a grumpy mood, but not that, I don't think he lost his face except in the Western media perceptions. So the next one. So this is what the West actually talked about. Nehru was pushed into the backseat by China. But the same Australian ambassador to Indonesia later wrote, and this is probably much closer to the truth, that Nehru's decline in prestige and Chou En-lai's rise in prestige was proportionate, according to the common wisdom in Jakarta. But it was, after all, Nehru who insisted on Chou being invited, who indoctrinated him carefully before the conference, and who sponsored him into difficult opening days at Bandung. Mr. Nehru did not strike me as feeling that he had been supplanted by Chou. He might have, of course, been concealing his feelings, but during the time I spent with him after the conference, he spoke highly of Chou's performance, and he was pleased with it. So he was not a person who felt being eclipsed, and he didn't. Okay, so going back to the few slides before, the pictures, going back, yeah. We still have, yeah, the next, previous one? No? Yeah, this one. No, that one. Yeah. So my analysis is neither Nehru nor Chou won. Both lost, because they came across as big powers, and the Southeast Asian countries felt a little intimidated by both. And Chou En-lai was praised for his very impressive performance, but didn't completely overcome suspicions of China. Ceylon, as I said earlier, criticized communism as a new form of colonialism. There was a polarization in Asia between pro-Western communist and non-aligned, 3 blocks in Asia at that time. But this actually was good news for Southeast Asian countries, because Southeast Asian countries were following India's lead, and to some extent nationalist China lead in regionalism. So Asian regionalism was driven for much of the 1940s and 50s by India. So the Conference on Indonesia, 1949, was held in Delhi. The first Asian Relations Conference in 1947, held in New Delhi. But after Bandung, the Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, realized that maybe we should have an independent Southeast Asian identity. Maybe countries like India or Pakistan, they're always fighting with each other and creating destruction. They are not for us. So, and similarly, China, it's good to have China at the conference, but we probably should not involve them directly in a regional organization. And that, to me, created a Southeast Asian identity that we know today, not including India, China, or Pakistan and Ceylon, but among the Southeast Asian countries. And that was really what paved the way for ASEAN. And this link is, again, not very clear to people, but it was an identity factor that was created. Southeast Asia really come out on its own and a winner. And another thing, not insignificant, this was the first conference for Japan after its defeat in the Second World War. First international conference, not the conference to sign a peace treaty, but first real multilateral conference. And Japan kept a very low profile and focused only on economic aspects, which continue to define Japanese foreign policy in Asia subsequent decades, even today. So all these are legacies of Bandung in terms of Asian regional relations. Okay, so go forward and we finish quickly. Okay, a comedy of civilizations. You can see that there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Christians, and a lot of Arab delegations, Prince Faisal over there, and there was absolutely no religious antagonism, the kind of thing that people talk about, clash of civilizations. That was not even an issue. And this is very remarkable, because today, if you have a conference, and especially with a bunch of people, and people have all kinds of, Islamic extremism and moderate Islam, radical Islam, there was no such, absolutely no such feeling at that time. And people could pray this, and people could eat together. The next slide, you can see that, again, President Nasser, and right next to him is Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the future Prime Minister of India, who came to Bandung with her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus. So they're all together, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian, and they're all having satay. So it's a satay diplomacy. Now, it's a pretty remarkable. I really wonder, I haven't been to a big multilateral conference, but, this kind of committee, this kind of interaction is very rare to find these days, even among the same countries. Okay, next one. George Pahin, the late professor at Cornell, said these are the kind of legacies of Bandung, which I agree with completely. Anti-colonialism, support for the UN, an educational function, understanding each other's point of view, and getting China more acquainted with the realities of China's international environment, and more restraint towards possible Chinese tendencies for aggression, and Chinese diplomatic independence for the Soviet Union. And I think most of this are borne out by the documents. But there is a lot more. As I said, the Sino-Soviet rift, the changing of the Cold War, the creation of non-alignment through Egypt's defection from the West were very, very important. Okay, go back to the next one, and I'll finish it. So there was few other things. The British ambassador to Indonesia said Bandung represented a fresh stage in international relations. The same British who were very skeptical and very afraid of Bandung came up with actually the best possible assessment of Bandung. The Americans were not comparable. The British actually came up with some very, very balanced assessment of Bandung. Anti-colonialism, and also Bandung Nkrumah couldn't come, but a couple of years later, he organized the first Pan-African conference, and he adopted the 10 principles, and he basically, Bandung had a diffusion effect in African, Pan-Africanism, and Nkrumah became a leading figure in non-aligned movement as well. But there were some negative legacies, and let's not forget about this. This might have contributed to authoritarianism. Many of the pro-Asian countries, like Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, who came victory at Bandung for the free world, actually were blinded to their domestic failings and turned to dictatorships later on. And this happened in other countries as well. And, but especially for these countries, I think Bandung might have contributed to kind of a legitimation of authoritarianism in an indirect way. And in some ways also, some of the more aggressive tendencies of pan-nationalism, like Nasser's interventions in the Middle East, Nkrumah's interventions in Africa, and of course, some of the issues we had in Indonesia as well. But this is an indirect link, and it had a lot to do with the Cold War. But I think one has to take into account some of the negative legacies of Bandung. It's not, generally it's positive, it was a landmark, but there are some negative aspects which you should keep in mind. Next one. The overall legacy, this is the British assessment. The East is no longer age-old, inscrutable. This is very flowery language. This is diplomatic language. They used to write beautiful English. Inscrutable, unchanging, it's young, eager, drunk with new nationalism and freedom, but also desperately anxious to behave with maturity and make a good showing before its elders, if not betters. It loses its angularity only when treated as a grown-up and as an equal. But like all adolescents, it's easily offended and easily influenced for good. There are many flowery languages in British documents like this. But the British actually developed a healthy respect. They certainly failed in causing embarrassment, not to mention maximum embarrassment to Chou En-lai. It was the other way around. Okay, next one. Well, the African delegates were a little quiet, except Nasser was an Arab African delegate, but they were very eager, because this really had a lot to do with their fate, because most of Africa was still under colonial rule, and Ghana didn't become independent. The first African country didn't become independent until 1957. So the Africans had a lot going in this conference. Okay, next one. The U.S. intelligence, State Department intelligence assessment was this, and this was quite actually laudatory. The nations assembled at Bandung without little prior experience in running large international conferences and with only decades or less of independent participation in world politics, managed to organize a meeting which rejected the discipline of any of the conference's 5 sponsoring powers, yet found its way to common ground with efficiency and dispatch. The conference succeeded in demonstrating that there is an Asian-African consensus. This is a huge concession from the US government, which was really worried that Bandung will upstage this containment strategy and give space to not only China, but also indirectly to the Soviet Union. So they acknowledged that this was actually an important success for the developing countries. Reluctantly, but they did. And finally, next one. The praise for the host Indonesia. There was a perception, again in the media, that somehow the Indians and the Indonesians were not the best of friends, and Nehru was a bit arrogant and looked down in a condescending way towards the Indonesians. But again, if you read Nehru's correspondence, and his best private correspondence was to Lady Mountbatten, the wife of the last governor or viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten. So he actually opened his heart to Lady Mountbatten, and this is basically what he said about Indonesia. Although there were 5 sponsors of this conference, Burma, Ceylon, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and we shared expenses and a joint secretariat, still a great burden of organizing it fell on the Indonesian government. They discharged this remarkably well. I doubt if we could have provided the same amenities in Delhi.
Thank you very much, Foreign Director. And Professor?